Okay, so obesity is unfortunately one of the trading issues in the modern life and causes many problems to individuals and societies. And on top of that, it may damage the central nervous system. Today, Filip will present an interesting field study on the obesities. Filip Morys is a postdoc researcher at Montreal Neurological Institute working with Dr. Alain Dyer. Filip is talking about obesity's impairs cognitive function via metabolic syndrome and cerebrovascular disease, an SEM analysis in 15,000 adults from the UK Biobank. And by the way, his talk is interactive, so he will present in 5 minutes and you can participate on the discussion after that. Thank you, Filip, for joining us today, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me and for organizing this excellent conference. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see it? Yeah, perfect. So great. Thanks for the introduction. As mentioned, I will be talking a little bit about obesity and how obesity can impair cognitive function and what the mediating factors in this relationships are. And this is a study that I did together with Masa Dadar and Alan Dagger. So just briefly introduce you to the topic. Obesity is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. And this has been shown already years ago, and we know that. Obesity also seems to be related to increased volume of white matter hyperintensities in the brain, which is a part of a cerebrovascular disease. And one factor that plays a role in this is the systemic inflammation that obesity causes. Obesity is also related to gray matter atrophy. And finally, we know from the past literature that white matter hyperintensities precede cognitive decline and gray matter atrophy. So what we wanted to do in this study is to see, to look at how obesity increases the risk for cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, how white matter hyperintensities play a role in this relationship, and what causes the cognitive decline. So to do that, we used the UK Biobank dataset with a sample of over 16,000 participants, aged around 63 years, with a body mass index BMI of 26 kilograms per meter squared and waist to hip ratio 0.87. With 5% prevalence of diabetes and 25% prevalence of hypertension. We designed a structural equation model that is depicted in this graph, and I would like to guide you through this. So we first defined obesity by a waist to hip ratio and body mass index, and we hypothesized that obesity will lead to metabolic syndrome that in this case was defined by dyslipidemia, inflammation, hypertension, diabetes. Dyslipidemia we defined as serum level of triglyceride and HDL cholesterol, and inflammation with the C-reactive protein serum levels. We then hypothesized that all those four factors of metabolic syndrome will be related to cerebrovascular disease, in this case, volume of white matter hyperintensities, which in turn would associate with cortical thickness, cortical volume, and subcortical volume in the entire brain. Finally, we hypothesized that all those factors independently could lead to cognitive decline, to poor cognition that in this case was defined by 6 different cognitive domains: working memory, fluid intelligence, prospective memory, executive function, visuospatial memory, and reaction time. And this graph at the same time is a result figure. All the solid lines depict significant associations and dashed lines depict not significant associations. So as you can see, obesity is in fact related to all the elements of metabolic syndrome, that is dyslipidemia, inflammation, hypertension, diabetes, which then significantly are related to cerebrovascular disease that, consistent with previous results, leads to differences in cortical thickness, cortical volume, and subcortical volume. And finally, 3 factors that are directly related to cognitive decline are obesity, our cerebrovascular disease, and our subcortical volumes. So we were able to show that obesity is indeed related to cognitive decline, and also certain factors that are specifically leading to this, that being cerebrovascular disease and subcortical volumes, decrease in subcortical volumes. We also followed up on this analysis, and we wanted to see exactly which brain regions in terms of cortical thickness, cortical volume, and subcortical volumes are related to obesity, and whether this relationship is directly mediated by white matter hyperintensities, so by cerebrovascular disease. And you can see in this graph that indeed there were certain regions, especially in the temporoparietal regions of the brain, that were significantly negatively related to obesity, and all those were significantly mediated by white matter hyperintensities. So that means that obesity leads to increased white matter hyperintensity, cerebrovascular disease, that in turn leads to decrease in cortical thickness and volume, and the same for subcortical volumes in areas such as thalamus, nucleus accumbens, and the amygdala. So to quickly sum it up, we showed that obesity leads to metabolic syndrome, which then leads to cerebrovascular disease, white matter hyperintensities in this case, and inflammation, hypertension, diabetes independently mediate this relationship between obesity and white matter hyperintensities. We also showed that white matter hyperintensities rather than gray matter affect cognition. This was the strongest association. The question now is, how do white matter hyperintensities affect cognition? We also did some additional analyses and showed that one of the possible mechanisms is white matter disconnectivity. So there is no sort of communication maybe between brain areas of gray matter. We also showed that obesity-related atrophy patterns are similar to Alzheimer's disease patterns, and this is the typical Alzheimer's disease pattern is, again, temporoparietal and also lateral frontal atrophy. And in the previous graph, I showed you that this is very similar to what we see in obesity. And then finally, this study might have some clinical implications. So the question that we can answer now is, or we will be trying to answer in the future, is, can dietary lifestyle changes and maybe medication be effective in decreasing the pace of obesity-related cognitive decline? So thank you very much for your attention. I'm open to any questions. Feel free to contact me at my email or Twitter. And there's a preprint available on bioRxiv under the same title. So just feel free to have a look.
Thank you, Filip. Thank you. That was great study. Yeah, so we have a Q&A if you want to ask question. Also, if you want to show up on a stage, feel free to write down in the Q&A that you want to follow up your question.
Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen.
So also, I have a question for the analysis that you did for the data. That was great. That was interesting. I'm pretty sure a bunch of clinical application I see on this study.
Hopefully.
Yeah, what analysis did you do? Like, is that the correlation analysis or causal models?
So that's the structural equation modeling, which I guess is supposed to, it could be interpreted as a causal effects, you know, that, but obviously the data is only cross-sectional, so there's only so much you can tell using this sort of analysis. I guess that, so the UK Biobank now has longitudinal data as well. So we will be trying to use that in the future studies and confirm our findings. I can say that the structural equation modeling hints at causality, but it's obviously not sure causal.
I'm curious, what kind of information is in this biobank that you're using? Like, you have the background, probably clinical background of people.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information. There's the data that the UK Biobank collects is also linked to all the health data that are available in the national database. So you can link it to every clinical appointment that the participants had. This is also a huge imaging study. So I think they managed to test now around 40,000 participants with they have brain imaging. And the goal is to have 100,000. So well, obviously it's now stopped because of COVID, but I hope they will, continue doing that. And there is a longitudinal follow-up on the imaging participants as well. So there's already, I think, 3,000 participants who have data on imaging data on 2 different time points. So it's a huge amount of data that
is amazing, because you can see the effect on the long term, that is the causal effect or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
You said that they are paused right now. I see a question by Pedro. Pedro, also, if you want to go on the screen, feel free to ask me. Congratulations for your work. In the future, are you interested in dissect which of the metabolic syndrome components have greater influence on white matter atrophy or cognition decline? Or do you think that those alternations as a whole are equally implicated?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So from the analysis that we did, we can already look at which factors have the strongest association with white matter atrophy, and this was the strongest factor was obviously hypertension, and this is very consistent with the previous literature. So hypertension is the highest risk factor for white matter hyperintensities in this case. In terms of cognitive decline, I don't think we looked directly at how metabolic syndrome is related to cognition in a direct way, but that is certainly something that we could have a look at. I think also because metabolic syndrome is sort of a cluster of symptoms, so it consists of all those, so hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia, and inflammation. I think it's also useful to look at it as a whole, especially given that most of those symptoms actually co-occur, right? So you have obesity co-occurs very often with type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and obviously dyslipidemia. I think it's important to look at it as a whole, but also the factors that are like the single factor that is most significantly associated with white matter atrophy is definitely hypertension.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Filip. That was great talk. I thank you again, and I will move on to the next speaker.
Thank you.
So in